All right, so I'm going to talk about things that tie in really well with what Dr. Briggs talked about, Dr. Black talked about, not nearly on the level of what Jack talked about, which, like everybody else has said, is just super depressing to see a high school student, and exciting, but depressing in many ways too, to see how productive he was and then to think back what I was doing in high school, which I won't share with you. But I want to talk about some of the things that what Dr. Briggs was mentioning, and way to really objectify that. And the way I titled this is "Wearing Your Emotions or Your Heart on Your Sleeve." I'm a cardiologist by training, so I didn't want to focus on the heart, but your emotions on your sleeve. And this expression, which many of you have heard, there's kind of some controversy of where it comes from. But the thought is that back in the jousting ages, when a knight was jousting for the honor of a woman, they would wear some article of clothing of hers, the neckerchief, around their arm. So they would publicly display their feelings and their emotions. So it's become to mean to be emotionally transparent. But it's really just been an expression. But now we have technology and sensors that Eric mentioned, both Eric Schott and Eric Topol yesterday. And I want to really delve into that technology and show what a wrist sensor can do. And many of you, especially in front, might notice that I have some sensors on. I don't normally do this. Some of you might say, well, he looks like somebody who's probably under house arrest. Maybe that's what it is. And it's not. I mainly just wanted to outdo Deepak on the number of wrist sensors. And I did that, but then I saw Jack on stage, and he must have had at least 15 different wristbands, so there's no way I was going to top that. But a lot of these sensors, and in fact, I'll show you as I go through this, I'm actually wearing 7 different sensors that can tell me my level of stress, which may be interesting, and we're just starting to accumulate data, but I think it holds a lot of promise for addressing a hugely important and underappreciated medical issue that affects all of us. So let me just start by looking at the burden of stress. There isn't a person in here, I'm sure, who has not felt some level of stress, but this is a study that was just released a month ago that looked at, it was a survey of 2,500 individuals and asked them in the last year, how often have you had a major stressful event, so stressful that it affected your quality of life or your life for at least some period of time? And you notice that it's about half the population in the past year said that. And you'll notice on the graph it said that it turns out that medical problems were major stressors, but there were other not unexpected things, financial and family issues. And that 25%, though, in the last month had some stressful situation. And it's not these are situations that were not just diagnosed with an illness or the like, but just the normal day-to-day things. In fact, the most stressful was just juggling schedules for family members. And I don't think there's anybody in the audience who's not used to that. And the stress that relates to can build up. And if you have multiple stressors, you have job stressors, you have family stressors, you have financial stressors, you have health stressors, all of that adds up, and it all adds up in a very personal, individualized way that I'd argue up until now, we've only been able to judge for either ourselves or, if it got severe enough, to see some kind of healthcare provider in a very subjective way. I mean, how many of you who kind of talk to somebody about all the stress going on in your life, and they've kind of, well, you think you got stressed. Let me tell you what's going on in my life. And everybody seems to kind of have their own idea of what stress is and feels that they can understand it. But as it turns out, we can't even really understand it in ourselves. And often, especially when we have chronic stressors, we don't recognize it because we're so used to them. So when we look at anxiety, which is a normal reaction to stress, and actually can be pretty helpful. So if I weren't at least a little bit anxious up here on stage talking to you, I suspect I'd be very monotone and slow and even more tedious than this may turn out to be. But because there's a little bit of anxiety and it keeps me walking around on the stage and talking in hopefully a more engaging tone of voice. It's really when the stress builds up and the anxiety becomes excessive, then it becomes a disorder that really negatively influences our day-to-day living. And that is pretty common. It's the most common, in fact, mental illness in the United States. It affects 40 million adults in the U.S., so about 18% of the U.S. population on an annual basis will have an anxiety disorder. It costs about $42 billion annually in the U.S. Either the individual treatment of it, lost work, lost school, all issues combined, $42 billion. And interestingly, and Dr. Briggs mentioned this a little bit too, that it cost it's estimated that 75 to 90% of all visits to primary care doctors have some stress-related component to it. And as noted, we don't do in mainstream medicine, we do a very poor job both recognizing that and then treating that appropriately when we meet that. And too often, as Steve pointed out, just a medication or a prescription is given, and that's all that we do. Now, the real problem with stress, as I alluded to, is that it's a very personal exposure, and this is just one list of 50 common signs and symptoms of stress. Well, if you go through the list, you see that they're all pretty normal things. Frequent headaches. Well, people can have headaches that have nothing to do with stress, but that's one possibility. Doing that. Neck aches, back pain, everything musculoskeletal pain is the most common issues that we have. It doesn't necessarily mean we have stress. Frequent allergic attacks, well, it could be that you're actually just allergic and may have nothing to do with stress. And there are many things, excessive belching and flatulence. So I thought my teenage son was his diet, but maybe he's stressed. And there are a lot of other things that are just common. This last one that I'll point out to, either you increase or you decrease your appetite. Well, what kind of measure of stress is that? And so I just want to show in these 50 common signs and symptoms of stress is just life. I mean, it's a common day-to-day thing. So it isn't like as a physician or as a family member even, or even as an individual and looking inside myself, I'm not able to say, oh, I have this, this, and this, therefore I must be really stressed. We just don't have that ability. We sometimes pretend we do, especially in the healthcare system, but in reality, it's not as easy as the cartoons on the side suggest that we can really identify somebody who is stressed out. Doesn't mean there's not a big market for trying to figure that out, and if you want to figure out for yourself, apparently a lot of people do want to stress, there are multiple books shown here. And in fact, when I looked on Amazon last week to see that if you just put in stress management as a book title, you get 40,552 results. So if you really want to understand how to manage your stress in a population-based way, because all of these books are not geared towards Steve Steinhubl or any individual person, because really no one understands what stresses me out and how that's different from everybody else. So these are all, very good and very helpful books, but they're designed for a population and a lot of assumptions that, work may not stress you out and other things that do stress out other people might not. So there's this real gap in both recognizing stress in an individual and then really in a very focused, personalized way saying, well, how do we measure? Or what do we do about that, and then what is really causing this individual to respond and improve in their stress? So let me lead you down where these sensors, I think, hold a lot of promise. And that's our understanding of how we know our physiology of stress. Again, stress is very common. Stress can be very helpful. If you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, it was very helpful that our ancestors got stressed and were able to run away. But it's only when it becomes unhealthy. But as we better understand the signals and what our stress response is, then we can look and measure these as specific biomarkers. So we have the autonomic nervous system, which may not be well named because autonomic means it's unconscious or involuntary. And I think what we're learning and through biofeedback and other mechanisms is not as involuntary as we think. It is in routine, but it is something that we can potentially change. And we have two kind of competing systems. We have the sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight response. So when you're, again, I'll go back to the saber-toothed tiger analogy, you're being chased, your pupils dilate so you can see better, your pulse increases, your heart rate increases, your heart contractility starts squeezing a lot harder, your airways dilate so you can bring in more air so you can run away, you start sweating, your blood vessels vasoconstrict to everywhere but really the skeletal muscles so that if you get cut or slashed that you're going to bleed less and all the blood is going where it needs needs to when you're running. And then at the time, you're not going to be eating or doing things, so your gut motility slows down, and you don't digest food because, frankly, that's not what's important in an acute stress response. You can imagine if you look at all these things, it's not hard to imagine how they could be bad if they continue for a long period of time. Now, on the other hand, you've got the parasympathetic system, which is a rest and digest kind of system that has almost the opposite effects. When your parasympathetic nervous system is really dominating, then your pulse is decreased and your heart contractility is less. You vasodilate your blood vessels, so that could lead to your blood pressure dropping. You actually salivate more because you're preparing to eat and digest food. So instead of the dry mouth you get when your sympathetic nervous system is taking over, you don't have that. Your airways constrict because, frankly, you don't need to move that much air anymore. Your gut motility increases. And there are a lot of studies that show that not only does it have this direct effect on the organs, but it also decreases your inflammatory responses because you're not worried about fighting infections or addressing an injury that you're about to have, but rather it's just kind of this nice area of homeostasis. So you have these two systems, and you can see based on the picture there that it really affects all parts of our body. But I'm going to focus a lot on what the two competing systems, you'll see both parasympathetic and sympathetic go to the heart. They also go to the skin. And that kind of forms the basis of how these sensor devices may work to measure that. So heart rate variability is one of those measures that we look at. So when you have a pulse of 60, that means there's about 1 second between every heartbeat. But in reality, you have 0.98 seconds and 1.2 seconds, and this variability between that. And the more variability that is, then that means the more relaxed you are in your parasympathetic system. And you can see in this very simplified diagrams of a frustrated heart rate variability and then a nice relaxed heart rate variability where it looks nice and clean. But measuring that is how a lot of these devices work. Another measure of our sympathetic nervous system, and many of you are familiar and you see on TV, is the lie detector test that measure these very slight variations in the electrical conductivity of your skin because of the small amount of sweat that your body will produce when you get nervous. And so that's the basis of this electrodermal activity or galvanic skin response, is measuring that small amount of stress. And there are devices, one of which I'm wearing, it's a research device, and so that's why it doesn't look as nice as others. But this graph here is of an MIT student during the day and looking at what is stressful in their day or not. So now, because we're tracking this and because there's such interest in obtaining objective data on stress, we have a lot of tools. As I mentioned, I'm wearing 7 different things I have on me that can measure stress in different ways. Some of them are as simple as a smartphone. So in one, I can just hold the edges of this and it can measure my heart rate variability for 2 minutes. On my iPhone, I can just put my finger behind the camera lens and it measures my heart rate variability and guides me through breathing to relax. There are other wearable devices that you can use. The wristband, I'm wearing an Amigo wristband and a Basis watch. And then there's a shirt that I'm actually wearing, and I wanted to be the first person to strip on stage for you today. And thank you. Anyway, but this shirt I'm wearing, it's at a company in Montreal that makes it. So it's measuring my 3 lead EKG as I talk to you, plus my respiratory rate and my activity rate. So I can tell, and I've done this once before and I don't do it anymore, but because I feel actually pretty comfortable talking, at least hourly, but I looked once when I measured and my stress level was like 99% and my heart rate was twice normal, so I don't measure that anymore. But you've got all these tools to do this. But there's a lot we have to learn. These are data from a study we did here at the Chopra Center looking at meditation relaxation, and I'm a huge fan of meditation, but if you just look, I'm not going to make you meditation experts, but you look at the top color graph, you can see there's a marked difference between these individuals. Well, meditation is not perfect for everybody maybe, and everybody has a different response. Dr. Schott yesterday had mentioned, you could just tell listening to him, he's probably not going to sit down and be mindful for 30 minutes without his mind wandering, and so maybe somebody like him, it's not perfect. But there's a lot of variability and a lot to learn. There are also these tools that measure electrodermal activity, including a bra, which I'm assuming is geared towards women. And then the one device I'm wearing, this Empatica, which is a research device that we're actually using in a PTSD study down at the naval base. And then there are other things. If I hadn't prepared my slides ahead of time, I would have mentioned the Muse headset and the EEG measurements that have that. There's voice recognition so that your iPhone can, or your smartphone can tell you if you're stressed. Facial recognition that can tell you when you're stressed, and then other devices that measure your respiratory rate and look for stress. So in my final slide, I just want to say, well, what does it really matter that we can measure stress? And I've done that, so sometimes I brought like the iPhone where you can quickly measure your stress level, and I'll bring it to my in-laws, and remember my mother-in-law saying, measures it, and it says you're moderately stressed, and so well, I don't feel stressed. Maybe I am stressed. Oh my gosh, I'm stressed. And then she kind of got stressed by the phone telling her she's stressed. So just measuring it isn't meaningful. But I think the real key is that there are ways to de-stress. But there's not one way. There is not any one way that's going to work for every one of you. There are multiple different ways. Now, this article focused on 20 of them, but I would argue there's probably 200 or maybe 2,000 different ways. And one of the key things of being able to measure our response to stress, I believe, is being able to measure what unstresses us and to realize what works. So they have, apologies, I don't know if it's crocheting or knitting, but it's something with the needles. Taking a long walk, eating chocolate is good. It's not going well. Other things, in fact, just this morning on the news, they were having a PTSD treatment with managing horses. Up there it is. And there was a great study of cancer patients that the Three Stooges, President Obama de-stresses by shooting baskets. There's meditation. There's reading a book. There's jogging. There's prayer. And there's yoga. And there's a gazillion others. This is one of the biggest, from a global standpoint. Anxiety disorders is the 6th leading cause of disability. It's been subjectively measured, that we have no good measurement and no personalized measurement. And what these devices allow us is the ability, for the first time, as we learn more, to identify what stresses you as an individual, and then most importantly, what we can do about it to keep you de-stressed. So thank you very much for your attention.
Scott, thank you so much for this. I work for the Atlantic magazine, and you no doubt probably read the cover story in the Atlantic earlier this year by my colleague Scott Stossel. It was titled, a best-selling book, My Age of Anxiety, Fear, Hope, Dread, and the Search for Peace of Mind. Right. And in this book, I don't know how many of you may have caught this. He was on Colbert, et cetera. But the entry to this, which ran in the Atlantic, is interesting. But when he gets beyond talking about the anxiety during his wedding, the anxiety over plane flights, and lots of other issues, he says he's buffeted with worry about his health and his family members' health, about finances, about work, about the rattle in my car and the dripping in my basement, about the encroachment of old age and the inevitability of death, about he really needs to get to the Chopra Center, about everything and nothing. Sometimes this worry gets transmuted into low-grade physical discomfort, stomach aches, headaches, dizziness, pains in my arm and legs, a general malaise. And when Scott wrote this book, the book went viral. I mean, anxiety is such a big deal, not often talked about. And I'm interested in whether the collective collage of your work, when you talk about the different measures and whatnot, is something that would give something with this, someone with this kind of wiring, new options.
Right. I think so, but I'd say we don't know yet. And really, the Chopra Foundation, and like some of that work I showed on heart rate variability, some of the work we're going to be doing in this upcoming Perfect Health retreat, is some of the large populations. So a lot of like heart rate variability data, electrodermal activity, up till now has all been laboratory-based. So you take a select, 10 or 20 people and you measure them in this very sophisticated way. So for the first time, we have the ability, and this is true for all sensors, but I'll focus on the measuring emotional stress. For the first time, we have the ability, several of these are commercially available, several more will be available in the near future, and there'll be more and more and more. But we'll be able to track populations of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of individuals, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and really be able to connect the differences for everybody, and with that, then be able to better understand what somebody like he can, what the best thing is to do or what's best for him. So that's a long answer to I don't think we're there yet, but I think for the first time we have the promise of being able to understand that.
Thank you. Great.
All right.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.